Welcome to our second plenary session, which we titled Between Hospitality and Hostility, Local Reactions on the Russian War Migrants. I want to say, and I would like to introduce you our colleagues and experts. Mostly these are our colleagues from our Crossing Borders Building Walls project, a part of Jussie Laine, who wasn't involved in that project, but still he represents the Karelian Institute at the University of Eastern Finland, who was the partner of this project. So in fact, he is our partner. I would like, before we will start, and what will be the formula of this meeting? We will have a general discussion between us, talking about reactions of our local communities and societies on the Russian migrants. And after these discussions, it will take about 1 hour and 15 minutes. We will open the floor for broader discussion. So there will be no presentations, but rather, we will have a talk. You will be able to see how our discussions for the last 1 year looked like, how talkative we all were. But before, let me very briefly, okay, because you have the bios and abstracts available on the QR codes. So I would like very briefly only introduce you our speakers. Raili Nugin. She is a sociologist working at the School of Humanities, Tallinn University, and she is an expert in rural youth, mobility, rural-urban relations, memory transmissions, and social exclusions. Jussie Laine, he is professor of multidisciplinary border studies at the Karelian Institute of the University of Eastern Finland. He's the president of the World Social Science Association and currently serves on the steering committee of the International Geographic Union's Commissions on Political Geography. Tomasz Rawski is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Sociology, University of Warsaw. He is a political and cultural sociologist focused on researching memory politics, war, nationalism, and state socialism in contemporary Eastern European and beyond. And he's coordinator of the conference, and he was one of our Warsaw team making the project. Ketevan Gurchiani is a professor of anthropology and head of the Research Center for Anthropology at Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Georgia. Her primary research focuses on the urban anthropology and environment and informal resistance practices. Karen Schenk is assistant professor of political sciences at Nazarbayev University, with teaching and research experience in politics of migration and national identity in Eurasia. Byambabaatar is senior lecturer at the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology and an academic secretary at the Institute for Mongolian Studies, National University of Mongolia. He now studies social transmission, political, economic, and ecology, and mining impacts in Inner Asia. And Tamilla Şahin is a PhD student at the Bursa, Uludağ University in Turkey, Department of Labor Economics and Industrial Relations, and her research interests include immigration, Meskhetian Turks, and their social issues. So thank you very much for accepting this participation to this plenary session. And I would like that we discuss a little bit, because we had this discussion during our meetings, but I think it will be super interesting for our interlocutors and our audience to learn something more about how the Russian migration to your country looked before the war, and how war impacted appearance on the one hand of Russians, migrants, and how the politics towards migration politics has changed within these 2 years of war. And if you could also say us something more about, this, how much you would call it hospital and how much hostile reactions. Tomek, could you start? Because you make your research both in Poland, in Serbia, in Turkey. If you could take the microphone, and exchange.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So if we speak about between hospitality and hostility, I will speak about two contexts, maybe. So Poland is closer to hostility, and Serbia is closer to hospitality, more or less. And these two contexts show how different migration policies can be towards Russian migrants in different states. Well, in Poland, state institutions are quite reluctant to allowing Russian migrants to enter the country. And when they finally allow them to enter the country, they are actually reluctant to do any institutional efforts to support them. So here we're having quite a strict migration policy. A Russian citizen can enter, as you may probably know, can enter Poland only on the basis of a humanitarian visa or on a basis of Karta Polaka, which is Polish charter, which is a kind of a document confirming belonging to Polish nation. So for a humanitarian visa, he or she must basically prove that his life was in danger in Russia, which basically means that he needs to prove his oppositional political activity to Putin's regime. And for a Polish charter, he or she must prove belonging to the Polish nation, at least through family ties. So needs to have an ancestor, for example, or at least through cultural ties. So each of these pathways is limited to a relatively narrow group of people, and each of them raises also additional problems. So, for example, to obtain Polish charter, it takes quite a long time to obtain. It requires passing a Polish language exam. It requires additional efforts. So if someone did not have this document before the war, they are rather unlikely to choose this path in an emergency situation, which is the war and requires quick actions, right? Now, humanitarian visa is usually granted for up to a year, and it can be obtained more quickly. But the problem is that a person is not allowed to take up legal work in Poland. So here we have the problem that if a person does not have their own savings, like large savings, which means if he or she was not from a privileged social strata, well, he is forced to function in a gray zone, to take up work illegally, black market, and so on. So this is the problem with humanitarian visa. And the other problem is that humanitarian visa is also difficult to extend after it expires once. So basically, this is for a year. So we're having many obstacles in Poland in terms of migration policies. It affects the shape of the social structure of this migration. I will not talk now about this because I would like to briefly speak contrast the Polish situation with Serbia. So Serbia is different. Any Russian citizen can enter the country and stay for 30 days only on the basis of a Zagran passport, right? Without any particular visa. There is no visa regime between Serbia and Russia. And then he or she has several options to extend the stay. So they can either apply for a tourist visa, which gives the opportunity to stay for another 90 days, or for a temporary stay up to a year, which is quite easily, or has been actually in 2023, quite easily receivable, and also has liberal criteria for extending. For example, it is possible to work on the basis of this temporary stay. It is possible to buy property, right? These basic indicators of stabilization. But for example, it is also quite easy to live on this visa run system, which has been mentioned yesterday by some presenters, which means that a person can choose to leave Serbia every 30 days for just a few hours to a neighboring country. For example, Bosnia and Herzegovina is a neighboring country to Serbia, and it also has a visa-free regime with Russia. So a person jumps out Serbia for a few hours, then jumps in back, and their 30 days limit is refreshed. So There's quite a lot of people in Serbia who like choose this way because it's relatively easy. The border with Bosnia and Herzegovina is relatively close, for example, to Belgrade, and there are already organized private transport buses for such practices. So this is quite widespread practice. So Serbia is basically willing to issue residence permits to Russians, comparatively, like to a bigger extent than Poland. So, as I said before, this shapes the structure of this migration differently in these two countries. But maybe I will. This is something which I can add up later. Now I think it's this. Maybe we can start discussing how these migration policies look like also in different countries.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Raili, because could you say us something about Estonia? Because Estonia has such a huge diaspora of Russians and people with so-called gray passports, and how the situation changed and when it started, in fact, to change in Estonia.
That's a difficult question. When did it start to change? Because I would say that Estonia has been a vocal advocate for sanctions against Russia. Well, basically the whole time it has been independent, but more particularly, I think, after the start of the first aggression towards Ukraine, the Donbass, and then the occupation of Crimea. However, we still had tourism back then, and if I'm not mistaken, Estonia was, in terms of tourists, the sixth destination of Russian tourists. So it was quite popular because it was close, it was Europe, and Tallinn was very popular among Moscow and St. Petersburg tourists. However, when the war started, then I think Estonia was the first one to start issuing the sanctions, the visa sanctions. You couldn't enter with the tourist visa anymore. And also study, you couldn't study anymore. Not only was on the state level decided that if you had a Russian or Belarusian passport, you couldn't get a study visa, but also the universities were pressured to I don't know, make a statement that they will not accept Russian or Belarusian students, which is like a double PR campaign against Russian citizens. So it was, I think it's quite similar with Poland, but maybe a bit even more hostile. So, but I wouldn't say that there was a sharp change, because there's always been this hostility towards Russia. However, having said that, Estonia has been also hosting quite a lot of oppositional figures, also before the Ukrainian war or after the first aggression. So, so in this sense, there's this, kind of balance of these cultural figures and their actual citizens, I would say. But yeah, it's been kind of step-by-step process, but it's more or less the same as Poland, that it's really, really hard to enter. And once you're entered, it's really hard to gain the documents, working permits, and all the rest of it.
Okay, so we have two European countries, and now maybe I would like to ask you, Lucy, because Finland is super interesting for years, very friendly country to Russians. It was normal to get a Finnish visa to travel to Europe, and what has happened?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. Let me tell you. No, thank you. I try to answer a little bit. Indeed, the relations used to be quite specific. And if we think of, really to answer your first question, how you started, how were the Russian migrants perceived before the war started? Quite warmly, indeed. We developed from rather positive, welcoming rhetoric to very negative as it is at the moment. And if we look further back, of course, during the Soviet time, any kind of interaction was highly regulated, right? So that kind of daily interaction or migration didn't exist. Before that, the relations were downright hostile, right? So when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of work was done to try to change the attitude towards Russia, also from economic perspective, because the background attitudes were very negative, and in Finland it was perceived that, you know, now that the Soviet Union has collapsed and we have this big neighbor, we have the city of St. Petersburg that has a population far greater than Finland as a whole. So it was seen as a major opportunity that, you know, we need to change our attitudes in order to utilize, to benefit from this neighbor. And a lot of work was being done to try to change first the perception of a border, of something very threatening or being barrier protective of a threat, to a resource, right? The resource to Finland. And at the same time, the attitudes towards Russians from something very uneasy to more normal. Even when I don't think I'm that old, but even I remember from my childhood, there were stores in Finland with the signs that one Russian at a time, which indicates quite a lot about the level of trust, right? And from that, we developed into a situation where the stores had big signs that, you know, we serve you in Russian, and, you know, welcoming Russian. So that, to me, is a bit drastic example, but you get the point how the attitudes change. Even though then, following the events of 2014 and the events in Crimea, when the political relations started to be very tense, at the local level, the relations were quite pragmatic for a long time, until now then the full escalation of the war. Even though Finland developed very anti-migrant policies, but being a country of very homogeneous population, a migrant was, and again, I'm speaking very bluntly here, a migrant was defined as a person who doesn't look like us, meaning that Russians fit in quite easily to the population. Nobody really cared when, especially the anti-migration parties in Finland, when they talk about migrants, they don't talk about Russians. Even today, when we have major problems at the border is now completely closed. Migration is constantly talked about as a threat, as an attack to our society. Russianness is not really playing a role in that debate. I can talk more, but I'm going to shut down and wait for the next question.
Yeah, thank you. So now I think we have like a little bit of picture in Europe, in these countries which are like bordering with Russia, and how it looks like. So maybe I would like now to go, you know, in the direction of Caucasus. Katie, could you tell us how this situation, you know, before the war, because you had the war with Russia in 2008, and the question is how were these relations before, with regard to what happened to you with the Crimea later, and particularly during the war?
Thank you very much, Zuzanna. As you might imagine, it was the attitudes towards Russia, Russian migration, were quite negative. And it was really between hospitality and hostility, as Florian Mühlfried, my colleague, also published a paper on that with this name, because Georgians are proud of being hospitable people, but at the same time, they are not sure that Russians are coming as guests, because it has certain temporality in it if you are a guest. And the experience of Russians coming to Georgia has in recent, maybe centuries even, been not so positive. So it feels on the level, it is connected very much with the political uncertainty, with economic uncertainty, with colonial uncertainties and grievances. To understand the situation from the Georgian point of view, it is on the one hand, these are people who are fleeing and they might need help. And so many Georgians also needed help or need help and migrate. So the attitude is there, we should open our doors, but how do we know as who they are coming? And there was also political uncertainty. At the one hand, the Georgian government would support all, would support Ukraine and would support all the sanctions against Russia, but would never impose visa regime or certain regulations for entering the country. So the Georgia was the next door open for many Russian migrants, and many migrants entered Georgia, much more than the Ukrainian migrants. So in 22, it was more than 63,000 Russians, and it was up to 25,000 Ukrainians. Now, to put it in the picture, Georgia had no big Russian diaspora. The biggest minority in Georgia is Azeri minority, ethnic minority, and then Armenian minority, and only 0.7% of population has been Russian, which amounts to 26,000 people only. So now from these 26,000 people, only 13,000 were residing in Tbilisi. And out of these 13,000, all of a sudden, almost 100,000 new incomers created a new situation. It was also a linguistic uncertainty from side of maybe from Russian migrants too, because they assumed that in Georgia, like in other republics, people would talk freely in Russian. But it was increasingly not the case, as in Georgia, also in the Soviet times, this kind of chosen glory was attached to always having education in all three levels, in tertiary education, higher education, etc., in Georgian. So the Georgian elite would go to Georgian schools, to Georgian universities, and would be proud of it. So this kind of self-orientalization was less part of the culture. And this titular nation, which was Georgia, and became very much entitled nation also. Yeah, and this is a difference, I would say, but not to take more time, I will give to somebody else.
Okay, thank you, Kares. And my question to you, because for years you are researching migrations, could you say how, from your perspective, what has changed in Kazakhstan? Because we could see the, I would say, quite visible and position of President Tokayev at the beginning of the war. We were like haven't expected such a strong position. But what about, because there is so many Russians living in Kazakhstan, and how it changed in Kazakhstan?
Yeah, I think that this is a good question. And I think that, one thing that I wouldn't say is that I wouldn't say that this is a provocative statement. I wouldn't say that there's a Russian diaspora in Kazakhstan. I don't think that there's a Russian diaspora in Kazakhstan. There are ethnic Russians. Oh, good. I'm glad that you agree with me. I mean, as the person who's really from Kazakhstan, and I've lived there for 12 years, but I'm a migrant in Kazakhstan also. There are ethnic Russians who live in Kazakhstan, but they're not a Russian diaspora. Their home is Kazakhstan. And one of the things that the migration of Russians from Russia to Kazakhstan really solidified is that those Russians are different than the Russians in Kazakhstan. The Russians that were coming to Kazakhstan are different in many, many ways. So, I mean, what does it even mean to be ethnically Russian in Kazakhstan? I mean, sometimes this is a really flattened picture. I mean, we have these categories of ethnicity, and we use these categories, like we talked about them yesterday, of Rossiyskiy, Rossyanin, Kazakh, and Kazakhstani. And I mean, these are things that scholars try to use to make categories meaningful, but they're a lot less meaningful to actual people on the ground who have really very mixed and hybrid identities. So, I mean, yes, we may have Russian written on identity documents in Kazakhstan, but these are often quite mixed identities that may be partly Kazakh and partly Ukrainian and partly Belarusian, but as a census point, you know, we say that there's 20% of the population that's ethnically Russian. So I would say that the idea, that's one thing, right? That there's a lot more hybridity than, you know, than we give credit for. And that the Russians who came were really like, they were visibly different, but they were also different in mentality and attachment and all of these sorts of things. And then politically, yeah, the government finds itself quite in a tricky position, right? So because Tokayev has been very strident on the one hand, saying, no, we won't recognize these annexed republics. On the other hand, doing a lot of things that are very quite pro-Russian and that make the population in Kazakhstan angry. Because there's a lot of ambivalence, right? That I think that this, unlike Georgia, even though I think that people in Kazakhstan responded with these same sorts of colonial ideas in mind, in Kazakhstan, it was really something quite new, I think, that happened as a result of the war and the mobilization, that this was one of really the first time that many people in Kazakhstan were becoming aware of the idea that we really need to figure out our position vis-a-vis Russia, and we actually have a choice. And the choice is maybe that we are different, right? We're different, and what it means to be, even what it means to be Russian in Kazakhstan is different. What it means to speak Russian in Kazakhstan is different than this idea of Ruski Mir. And all of those things became really important and really salient.
Thank you. Byamba, how much what Kare said is also current for Mongolia?
Sorry, say again?
How much what Kare said about this approach to Russian migrants is also like current for Mongolia?
Well, thank you so much. And first of all, I'd like to raise who's Russian migrants. Are they a majority or minority of those from Russia? I mean, the Buryatia, Kalmyk, or Tuvans, they are minorities, and so they are kind of Mongolian ethnic people. About that, the Slavic Russians, you know, this total different story. And so, based on my research, in addition to our 15 respondents, I interviewed experts in the Mongolian people about their attitudes and also how they feel about the migrants. And then based on that, probably I would say at the 3 level and also in 2 events, the war started and then mobilization. And at the interpersonal level, the war really confused Mongolian public and people, because many people who are about 50 years, they are graduated in Ukraine, Russia, and many Belarus, many places. And so they don't know, and quite in a shock, who to support. That was the first one. And then at the social media level, there was a huge debate in Mongolia. And there was a couple of questions. And what should Mongolia do if one of Mongolia's 2 neighbors, Mongolia is landlocked between China and Russia, you know, and 2 neighbors conduct aggression toward Mongolia? That was the huge topic. And will there be any support from international communities over the Russia and China? What happens if they block, you know, air and land? And then will there be any support from international communities? And also it reminded the public about xenophobia. And back in to 2014 about the Crimea annexation, and there was a huge discussion in a WeChat in China, you know, why China could not annex Mongolia, maybe the lost country or something, you know, nationalists. And so this was a huge debate. And then third, about the physical activity level. And it further led to organic, somehow mechanic demonstrations against the war, and including no war movements, and also funny pro-Russia also demonstrations. These demonstrations, that the pro-Ukraine or anti-war movements hijacked by kind of secret organizations funded by Russia or maybe embassy of Russia. And those Russians or those organizations, organized pro-Russia demonstrations followed by many fake, Facebook fake accounts and trolls. And then they just, send a message to Mongolian audience in public about the glory of Russia and all those things. And it brought the diplomatic and also political clashes between Mongolia's foreign ministry and also Russian embassy in Mongolia. And then there was, and the main message was stop meddling and also intervention in Mongolian domestic issues. That was from the government of Mongolia. However, Mongolia keep its neutrality on war. About that, the second wave of impact comes from the mobilization, and it really turned Mongolian society almost 100% to protest war and aggression. Mongolian public supported, and welcomed Mongolian ethnic people, Kalmyks or Tuvans or maybe Buryats, of course, most of them Buryats, and also Slavic Russians, they welcomed. And many researchers, yesterday you discussed. And the analysis of this interviews and also participant observation, says that this mobilization kind of recentered Mongolia among those Mongolian kind of ethnic people who are divided in Russia and also China and Mongolia. So that was the main take here.
Okay, thank you very much. Tamilla, а сейчас вопрос к тебе. Но мы все смотрели на Турцию, которая многие веки воевала с Россией, и вот сейчас пришла началась война. И можешь рассказать, какой подход турчан и государства к этой всей войне, чтобы мы чуть-чуть больше поняли?
У Турции с Россией с давнешних времен свои отношения, еще и с Османской империей, и еще в то время было большой миграционный переход, да, после 90-х годов и после Советского Союза. Опять-таки с Россией, с Российской Федерацией было очень много иммигрированных в Турцию. На нынешний день турецкое правительство и коренной народ не хотят, конечно же, этой войны, но население к людям, которые приехали с России, нет у них никакого негативного влияния. Больше всего негативное влияние на данный момент у нас к сирийцам, к афганцам, так как число сирийцев превышает 4 миллионов на данный момент в Турции, и к афганцам такое же негативное влияние, потому что в основном 90% афганцев, которые на данный момент существуют в Турции, они все перешли границу одни, только мужчины. Женщины остались в Афганистане, так как им там не угрожает, их жизни не угрожает ничего. И турецкий народ больше всего большее негативное влияние на сирийцев и на афганцев. А число российских приезжих после войны не такое большое кажется, таким значительным кажется среди этих 4 миллионов. На данный момент даже в исследовании, когда я проводила в исследовании, интервьюируемые, был такой вопрос, как вам относятся местные жители. Все говорили, что турецкий народ очень гостеприимный, во многих вещах, в основном в документах, всем им помогают, где непонятно, даже один опрашиваемый говорил, что его, как сказать, и друзья помогали. Так что с обоих сторон как бы нет никакой такой негативной реакции.
Thank you. Спасибо. Okay, so now I would like to ask you, could you say what was the most interesting finding of our common research and what has happened for last 2 years? What, I'm thinking about this approach to Russians towards war, and what you found the most interesting and also in our research. And yeah, please, like, who wants to start? I don't want to ask you, yeah?
Okay, I have microphone. So, well, it is interesting to see the Mongolian public and also how they're reacting, and also how they, the attitudes toward Russian migrants. And there was, Mongolia is a Buddhist country, and the thinking is a little bit different. And there was, of course, same as other countries, and there was an empathy and love. Almost every person welcomed those migrants as their relatives coming back home. That was the first one. And second one was about that anger about sending those ethnic minorities of Russia to the war. And there was, my colleague will discuss about later tomorrow, Zolzaya, about this post, about the many ethnic Buryats were killed and even, become a prisoner of wars. And this really affected the both sides. And also the Buddhist approach of the compassion, wishing people to be free from the suffering. And this was the Mongolian also reaction. And also it is interesting to see, after analyzing all these interviews. Of course, many people from migrants, for example, big emotions and tearing up after the crossing Mongolian borders and becoming, overcoming that the fear when probably they might be stopped at the granicy or the border. That was, and also that the Buryats and Kalmyks, they become a kind of privileged group in Mongolia, and they were so happy and feel comfortable. And about that, the small statistics, I received a lot of information from Statistics Office, Bank of Mongolia, and also Immigration Office. And then I keep writing, and they didn't share. Anyway, it seems that since the start of war, almost 54,000 Russians came to Mongolia, and then they left to somewhere else. Maybe the Europe and Korea, Thailand, and many other countries. And so Mongolia was kind of transition, transit country. And also after the mobilization, 6,600 people, mainly men, entered and stayed over 3 months or something. And then Mongolian government and also the educational institutes, including my university, for example, they reopened the admission to the Russian migrants to study probably in a master's or bachelor's or maybe language course. And in addition, also many language centers, they opened the door, and then immigration office also give them a kind of legal, status to apply for the visa regime of that extend the visa. That was the interesting. Yeah.
It's okay. So it was a very interesting opportunity for me, this project, because this Russian migration to Georgia was something that we approached, it was very visible, but remained invisible on a personal level. So this project gave me the opportunity to really listen to personal stories, because if you treat people as kind of number of 63,000 people, it becomes so faceless. And this project allowed me to put faces and fates into that. And many people that I met were quite affluent. They still had their tragic stories. And it gives you this very human dimension of the suffering. And then you understand that a migrant should not be poor to be to need compassion also. It was, for me personally, as an urban scholar, it was very interesting to see also this tactical use of camouflaging, because the Russian migrants in Georgia would try to camouflage their cafes, etc., either in support of Ukraine, or they would take a style that is very cosmopolitan, whereas the Ukrainian migrants would really display their Ukraineness on the front stage. That was very interesting. But also how over time those migrants kind of adapted, those who stayed in Georgia, how they try to also greet in Georgian and so adapted to the circumstances. On the other hand, it remains very interesting to study the effects of this very gentrifying migration. So compared to other countries, in Georgia, it is a very gentrifying and declassifying migration. So the middle class of Russia that comes to Georgia outnumbers the Georgian middle class, or maybe not in necessarily in numbers, but their money is much more than the Georgian middle class money has been, or the what they could afford and what we can afford now. So it creates long-term difficulties, and it also disrupts the social fabric of certain places in Tbilisi, etc. So there are many urban, human, etc. effects that are very interesting for me.
Yeah, actually, this is a really interesting point, and I think an interesting contrast with Kazakhstan. And I think because in Kazakhstan, there's just not the ability to have this sort of discussion in the public space, right? This idea that like being visibly anti-war is, I mean, there's a lot of restrictions on that in Kazakhstan. And so these kind of moral positionings had to take place in different ways, right? In Kazakhstan. And I mean, I think, yeah, there was this, there was like, it was very interpersonal too, right? So it was less about symbols, and maybe graffiti was a big theme in your report, which I found really interesting. But it was really interpersonal, right? And because like we would have, people encountering Russians in bars and saying, Chikrim, like who does Crimea belong to, right? As a sort of filter question of like, where do you stand on all of these things? And I think, I mean, most of the young boys that were coming, they just didn't know how to answer that, right? Because when you're steeped in sort of an imperial ignorance, and I mean, I have my own coming from America, you just don't know how to answer those questions. I mean, you just don't know what the right answer to those questions are. And so by like bumbling and stumbling through those really deeply interpersonal, uncomfortable interactions was really uncomfortable and at the same time meaningful, and also I think really, really exhausting, right? I think this is something that really typifies both sides in the Kazakhstani story, both the migrants that have come and the whole kind of decolonial debate that it provoked within the domestic population. because there's no space for protest or, I mean, there's online space for kind of debating these ideas, but because there's a lot less public space, it just costs a lot, right, to have these debates and to kind of to wrestle out these arguments and things like that. So, I mean, we still, I mean, one thing that's interesting about the migration to Kazakhstan is there are still Russians that have moved and have stayed. And I think that they have wrestled with those questions quite deeply. Like, what does it mean to be, like, what does my Russianness mean? What does my whiteness mean vis-a-vis, you know, where I find myself in the world these days? And I don't think that a lot of people could really escape that, but that's really exhausting, right? It's not an easy process, and but it's something that they couldn't really escape if they decided to stay. Just one other thing that I think is really interesting. So, I mean, Kazakhstan of these cases is the only sort of authoritarian case. But that's actually not the most important thing about Kazakhstan. And if we think about Kazakhstan first as being authoritarian and then all of the other things that maybe it could possibly be, I think we miss a lot. And the way that this shows up in the migration kind of comparisons is that Kazakhstan is seen as like a last resort, a destination of last resort. Not thinking that actually people move there on purpose, like me, but also others. And this actually matters, right? Because there is this sort of discourse when we compare migration destinations, like, of course, migrants would want to go to Europe, right? But like, no, but actually some of them really do prefer to be in Kazakhstan for a lot of different reasons. So this idea that it's a migration destination of last resort because it's visa free, because you can get in on внутренний passport without a Zagran passport. Yeah, these things are important and they create a sort of exigency, but they also really obscure the idea that people actually, you know, can and do move to Kazakhstan on purpose, right? And stay there on purpose. It's not just an accident.
Yeah, I would say a lot of things were interesting in this project. So thank you for inviting me to join. What was the most surprising, I think, perhaps it's very logical, but it still surprised me that this overwhelming pessimism of the informants. Like when I asked them, like, what do you think the Russia will become, or what do you think will happen in the future? That even those who were actually very politically active, organizing rallies pro-Navalny or like anti-Putin in front of the embassy and doing all those stuff, they still said that there is no hope, or if Putin will step down or die, then, you know, back then Prigozhin was alive still, that, you know, the alternative could be Prigozhin or somebody, Kadyrov or something, and that could be probably even worse. So they actually didn't really believe in the future of Russia at all. So that was something that surprised me. And also perhaps this these tensions that were between the local Russians of Estonia, that is quite a lot, quite a big minority in Estonia, less than 1/3, but more or less. So there were tensions, and there were people who said that, like, go back to Russia, and that was something also probably that it's so tense. Also surprised me, I think.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I mean, there are maybe a lot of more similarities between Estonian and Polish approach than I previously thought. But it was not surprising for me, though, that Polish society has negative attitude to Russian migrants because obviously we have a long history of anti-Russian stereotypes, but more importantly, since the annexation of Crimea, this all these anti-Russian stereotypes were heavily politicized by all political options, and they entered the center of public debate. So we're like living in the anti-Russian hysteria for over like a decade in Poland. So this is right now very strong, but maybe not very surprising, still interesting. The other thing that is interesting, that was interesting to me, was actually revealing the dynamics between Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian people who came to Poland. Obviously, we approached this relation only from the point of view of the Russian migrants, but to give you some numbers, we're having like now about 1 million Ukrainians, and used to have like more than 2 million Ukrainians in Poland, about more than 100,000 of Belarusians, and probably, according to different estimates, around 30,000 of Russian like newcomers, right? So these are the proportions. So actually, this is a very small migration of Russians compared to the other ones. What was interesting to look at was that there is a deep cleavage between the Russian migrants on the one hand and the Ukrainian and Belarusian migrants on the other hand, which the latter two groups tend to regularly cooperate with each other, cultural initiatives, social support, like publicly visible cooperation, while the Russian migrants like stay distanced and stay a lot more dispersed among each other. So they tend to not to organize themselves in any publicly visible way, because there are obviously like informal ways of making support groups and so on. But this is a difference. And what was interesting to me was that even among, even respondents who claimed the anti-war position, their anti-war position, and actually, if you are in Poland on a humanitarian visa, it might like be some kind of a proof that you had anti-war activity. So even they spoke that it is difficult for them to establish lasting regular cooperation with equally anti-war Ukrainians and Belarusians, which would mean that actually this top-down political polarization penetrates very deeply into social reality. So which would mean that holding a passport is like a certain passport, Russian or Ukrainian or Belarusian passport, is much more important to position yourself against other people than your own political position. So among anti-war positions, there is a clear cleavage based on what passport you have. And I remember one responding telling this meaningful sentence, which like somehow maybe sums up this cleavage. He said that Putin put blood on the hands of every Russian citizen, actually. So this I think that sums up somehow the general atmosphere in which the Russian migrants now function in Poland. So they feel that they also have blood on their hands, regardless if they were anti-war political anti-regime activists or not. This is something interesting.
Сейчас, Тамила, ты бы могла нам сказать чуть-чуть про то, что было для тебя самое интересное в нашем исследовании, что так и новое внесло, да, в твой взгляд? Да.
Ну, для меня изначально было интересно то, что покидавшиеся Россию люди даже в аэропорту или переходя границы не разговаривали между собой. Когда спрашиваешь, вам кто-нибудь помог или вы с кем-либо общались на границе, все говорили, что нет, зачем? Потому что каждый боялся. И они говорят, ты не знаешь, кто напротив тебя сидит. Может, там какой-то агент сидит. Мы, говорит, сидишь в самолете, летишь, двое сидим, друг друга спрашиваем, а куда ты летишь? Да, я так просто прогуляться по туристической визе, и говорит, друг на друга смотрим и смеемся, потому что он тоже знает, что я по той же причине, как и он, летим. И даже в Турции они не очень как бы пересекаются между собой и не очень тесно общаются на эту тему. Для меня это было как-то, ну, как сказать, удивительно, потому что люди бегут, у них одна проблема, как бы совместная проблема, но несмотря на это никто друг другу не доверяет. И не знаю, даже в Турции, может быть, где даже в Турции они не разговаривают с русскоговорящими, потому что тоже не знают, кто они. Вот они настолько боятся, я вот это вот поняла, что они вот настолько боятся. И даже они очень, вот 2 дня уже все об этом говорят, они в основном пользуются телеграм-каналом. И, как они сказали, это самый такой канал, где можно спокойно говорить. А остальные, например, WhatsApp или другие средства информации отслеживаются.
Тамила, у меня еще такой вопрос, потому что Бямба сказал про то, что Монголия более как бы открылась, да, очень для бурят, калмыков, вот этих групп, которые считают как бы одним этносом. Ну, ты сама мешкетейская турчинка, и можешь рассказать, я знаю, что ты брала тоже как бы интервью у этих людей, про эту группу, да, как они тоже как бы displaced в многих местах, как они, как бы, что они говорят, что это война для них?
Ну, там было несколько, как сказать, русские, этнические русские на вот эту позицию и все, что происходит в их стране, относятся по-другому. Некоторые говорили, мне было тоже как-то не по себе. Мне один опрашиваемый, ну, у одного, у кого я брала интервью, он сказал, мне стыдно говорить, что я русский, потому что эта война или то, что там происходит, это не наша, как бы, мы на это не давали своего, как сказать, положения. Все, что происходит, это не связано с русским народом, а то, что происходит, это уже все на политическом уровне. Татары, ну, тех, кого я опрашивала, у них, у крымских татар совсем другая позиция была. Они полностью с большим негативом относятся к этой ситуации. Ну, это еще связано с тем, что Крым как бы был при Украине, теперь стал при России. С этим вопросом они как бы с этой войной и насчет Путина очень негативно относятся к этой ситуации. Другие татары, казанские татары, тоже у меня были вопросники. Они как бы, как сказать, более-менее спокойно, когда все успокоится, мы вернемся обратно. И у всех опрашиваемых, 15 человек я провела интервью, для них Турция как переходная точка. Как они найдут возможность, если бы у них была возможность изначально, они бы все хотели бы уехать в другие страны, в Европу, в США. А так как в Турцию можно заехать легче, даже не надо иметь визу, они могут 90 дней присутствовать в Турции. И не нужно много документов для этого. Из-за этого как бы переходная точка. Чуточку продержимся, как бы посидим, и уже куда можно будет возможность уехать. Думали все так.
Спасибо.
So I also, in my research, I also encountered people who came from North Caucasus, and they reported a very different attitude towards them on the border by Georgian border guards, but a very different attitude than from the population, because they became easily part of the of Georgians as North Caucasians, though they were very much segregated at the border. And they also found this situation of migration as kind of place and time where they could proceed with their resistance or move forward. So that was important for them. And I followed up their lives, and now they ended up in Germany as far as the humanitarian visa, etc. So their paths are different from paths of others that I followed. Just the way.
You see, yes. Because you are like making your research for years. Yeah, you a little bit know about us, our project, but can you say something more about Finnish society and these changes, and what for you as the researcher of migration is so like astonishing or interesting, or what kind of questions you ask at the moment?
Well, I think what's astonishing is really that how something that was built very consciously for the last 30 years was basically thrown away overnight when the war escalated. And it makes you wonder how true really the past situation was. It seems to me that there was a lot of anxiety, there were a lot of negative feelings, maybe also in the past. But given the political situation, it was not okay to voice them at that time. And now when the war broke, people are finally openly stating some of those ideas that they were kind of forced to hold back before. It's that's how it seems to me, which then puts the past developments, of course, in a little bit different perspective. What we see now is that kind of traditional strength of the society, a small homogeneous society as Finland, has always been that we are very unified nation, and the situation today has really made the society internally torn and very polarized. I mean, this is what we see all around Europe, but I think in Finnish case it's quite striking. So it's always difficult to answer like that, in Finland people think like that, or this is the Finnish perspective, because I don't really know what that average Finnish perspective is. We have two opposites, and if you put those two opposites together and make an average, it's not very accurate to be honest. It seems that many of those results that happened throughout the last 30 years, where the formerly closed border became very transparent through especially intermarriages. So we have a lot of families in the marriages across the border, which was considered to be a very good thing during the last 30 years. How that has now become a very major challenge, how those mixed families have become security issues, how people with dual citizenship are in very difficult position in Finnish society. Today, we recognize multiple citizenship. Russia does not recognize, at least not with Finland. So there's a lot of debate, and very formal debate. For example, today, if we can actually cancel afterwards dual citizenship when it comes to Russia, which is a quite interesting legal process. If a person has gone through the formal steps, legally gained a Finnish citizenship, being a Russian origin, if we now, in retrospect, terminate their citizenship, I'm not a legal scholar, but I think it's not that simple thing to do. But really, the Russians in the Finnish society are now considered as a major security threat, and that of course changes the functioning of the society quite a bit. Russians are the biggest minority in Finland, even though still small. I think we have 94,000 Russian speakers, and as discussed here already, that it's quite a loose category, Russian speakers, but almost about 34,000 Russian citizens and another 30,000 dual citizens, so 66,000 Russian citizens living in Finland. So out of 500,000 of migrants who live in Finland.
Raili, you wanted to add something to this legal status of dual citizenship?
No, not really, but a similar case in Estonia in terms of legal obstacles, or like which shows also this Estonian government's really eagerness to make lives for Russians really bad. It's we have, like you said, we had this minority of Russian-speaking community who has been living there for maybe many of them have been born here, but they do have Russian citizenship because they haven't been able to, I don't know, do the citizenship examination or something like that. So right now, but according to the law, you still have the right to vote on local elections, regardless of your citizenship. And now for 2 years, there's been discussion about taking this away from Russian citizens, which is again, I'm also not a legal scientist, but probably also very complicated legally to take away the right to vote on local elections from the people who were born actually in Estonia. And you take away from Russian citizens, but the British citizens can still vote. It doesn't really make sense. Probably it's not possible, but it's actually on the table for years now in Estonia.
Okay. There are such discussions in Kazakhstan or Georgia, or no such problems.
I mean the legal space is quite different in terms of, the legal space it got a little bit more restrictive after Russians started coming, because of course they could come visa-free, 90 days, people could do visa runs, then they canceled visa runs. But in terms of like Russians getting citizenship, this is not really something that is happening. They're getting vid na жительство, and this comes with various complexities and nuances. It's also not particularly problematic, I guess.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, please, you want to add something?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. Like well, about that legal situation, Mongolia's cases, I in the beginning of my speech asked about who's Russian migrants. And so for Mongolia, there are kind of ethnic Mongolians, Kalmyks, or maybe those ethnic minorities in Russia. And so Mongolia's policy is a little bit different, not the Slavic or that aggressive Russians, but it is a relatives, kind of distant relatives. And so Mongolia is welcoming. However, there is no such discussion officially, raised at the parliament or whatever. There is informal discussions, of course, yes, and it is not formalized yet. About that, the interesting thing is about Mongolia's visa regime is different for Russians and also Ukrainians. Ukrainians, they can stay without visa for 90 days. Russians, just 30 days. And also extension is more easier for Ukrainians rather than Russia. Because, Russia and Mongolia had a bitter history in the past, Russia imposed the visa regime after 1990s, and then Mongolia also imposed the visa regime. But the Ukraine, they didn't. They opened the door and border for Mongols. And so there is a diplomatic issues. And also the Mongolian officials, I would say, without legal documents or revising, they just facilitate and make it easier for Russian migrants to extend the stay. That was the Mongols.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you foremost to the panelists for your talk and presentations. And now I would like to invite you for the coffee break. But I would like also to remind you if you could put your identificators, okay? Because due to the security reasons, it is necessary to